everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Christian Contrarian. I'm Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and this is episode 26, The Hierarchy of Angels, part 3, The Elementals. In past shows, I covered off in parts 1 and 2 of the Hierarchy of Angels, all the various kinds of angels and how they're set up and how that comes down to the earth. And I wanted to leave the elementals to a separate show because they're so very, very important for the end time. And then the pandemic comes along, and I decided to do a couple of shows on birth pangs and the two tribulations so that people could understand where we are in prophetic chronology and better understand the things that still need to happen. And so I'm going to return now to talking about the players that we need to be concerned with, and elementals I reserved for this show. And we're going to link what elementals are, both from the occult to how they show up biblically, who they are, and why we need to be very, very concerned and understand who these elementals are. So in the occult world, there's 4 classifications of fairies. You have the fairies who come from other planets, and these are rebellious fairies led by the proud fairy. So that's an allegory for angel, just as fairies are a matriarchal allegory for the bloodlines of the Nephilim. So that's the first class. And in this fairy mythos and religion, because it's an ancient religion, when these fairies come to the earth, they produce the second class, which are what we would understand as the Nephilim. And the best way to understand who some of these are would be the Tuatha De Danann of Ireland, Scotland, and England, and of course the ones that were in Norway, Sweden, Germany, and Russia, and all along the Danube as they migrated up. And so there's 2 different classifications, but these are known as the fairy folk. These are the fair people. So they are fair-skinned, pale white skins, and typically the ones in the Irish tradition have hazel eyes and red hairs, and in the German tradition and the Norse tradition they have blonde hair and blue eyes. And of course that's where all of the Aryan mythos sort of goes back to from Nazi Germany. Interesting connection, but we're not going to go deep into that today. But so you understand that these are the offspring of the fairies, the offspring of the fallen angels. And then you have the banshees, or the demon spirits as we would understand that biblically, and there's a few other terms in the fairy culture that they would call these types of spirits. And so these are the bodiless spirits of the earthborn fairies, or the Tuatha De Danann, which is the most famous ones. And then you have a 4th category, which are the elementals that we're going to address today. And sort of just roughly sketch these out. They're broken down into 3 kinds of little people. And these little people, with their 3 different classifications, are standard or constant, coming out of prehistory and history all around the world, in all cultures, on all continents, except for Antarctica. Who knows what we might learn about connections to Nephilim and the little people, the elementals in Antarctica, as more of that information starts to come out. So these are the ones that we're going to be talking about. And the 3 classifications in a generic sort of understanding are the mischievous ones, which would be ones like the leprechauns. You have good-looking ones, which would be like nymphs or Tinkerbell and Peter Pan. And you would also have the ugly ones, as are depicted in, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and so much of the fairy mythology. They are the gnomes, they are the hobbits, they are the dwarves, they are the elves. So these are the ugly ones, the trolls. And there's a whole number of different classifications within these 3 different lanes of the elementals. So now we're going to connect these to not only back to the Bible, but we're also going to connect these elementals to what's going on as we would understand the alien mythos and the alien deception that will take place in the end time. And we're going to talk about these ancient beings, the elementals, how they affected our prehistory, how they affected our history, how they're affecting us kind of today, and how I think they're going to intermix with that alien deception as we get into the years closer to the last 7 years of this age. So many might find it interesting that we can actually connect the term elemental back to the Bible, to scriptural understanding as to who these beings might be and where they fit in that organizational structure. So we're going to begin in Galatians 4:3, where we're told that we are under the bondage of the elements of the world. And that word element goes back to the Greek word stoichion, which is G4747. And it is a very, very interesting word as it's defined, because as with most Greek words and with most Hebrew words, is they have more than one meaning. So I'm going to cover off those meanings, and then we need to understand from the narrative that it's in and other relative passages how to use that meaning so that we're not manipulating scripture, that we're applying the right understanding to that scripture. And so elements are defined as being part of the first principle, the first beginning. So either as an elemental aspect, as in the primary part of a particle, which is one of the meanings, or a thing, or as far as the first principle, the word archa, which is connected to angels and archons and the first beginnings of the world and the creations of these beings. And so there's a connection here in that word archa. We're going to come back and find out that there are other connections here that we need to be aware of. And so in the first principle, as an element, or in terms of an angelic relationship. And principle is that word archa, which also means magistrate and governance. And again, part of archon as part of the prefix to a kind of angels. And so we have that heavenly connection. And then you also have a connection to and a meaning that the elements can mean the heavenly bodies and the stars. And so we need to understand that as well. But stars also are allegorical in the Bible for angels. So again, we have a bit of a connection there. So give an example as to how we want to use this word in the right context, in the right meaning within the narrative. If we go to 2 Peter 3:10 to 12, and as we read further on, this is an end time prophecy where the actual elements of the world are going to melt. So the elements of the body, in this case, the earth and the particles and everything that makes up the matter of the earth are actually going to melt, as well as some of the ones in the heavens. So clearly, that's not talking about a angel or a member of that hierarchy of the angelic world. So again, we have to be careful. Just as in Hebrews 5, you're going to have the word element come up. And again, that's not going to be applicable to what's being talked about in Galatians, where we're under the bondage of this world. So in 4:9, for context, moving on from Galatians 4:3, we're told that after we're being saved, that we tend to be seduced back to the elements of bondage. So there's more to this than just particle elements or planetary beings. There's a bondage, a connection back to rule, which is that magistrate part, and that they are ruling this world because we're held enslaved by not just the physical matter, but the things that govern the earth, both visible and invisible. So it's very, very important to understand these things and where these elementals who hold us into bondage, how they hold us into bondage, and where they fit into the organizational structure. So now let's move over to Colossians, where we get the word rudiments. And we're going to be referring to Colossians 2, which I also think is talking a lot about the Essenes and many of their rituals. And we need to be aware of Essenic philosophy as they're going to be promoted as the Nazarenes and a kind of Christianity or Judaic cult. And again, we want to be very aware of it because I think Colossians is warning. You'll see some of that warning as we talk about their connections back to the rudiments and to fallen angels as well. So yeah, I'm going to start in Colossians 2:8 where the word rudiments show up. And again, that goes back to the same word as element does to stoichion. 4747 in the Greek Strong's Concordance. And in there, in 2:8, it talks about the philosophy of men are the rudiments of the world, or the stoichion, or the elements of the world. And this philosophy and vanity of deceit is what corrupts us and spoils us and makes us dead in Christ. And so even after being saved, we are tempted back by these philosophies that are in the world. And we need to understand that the philosophies are a formation out of the first three of the 7 sacred sciences that I talk so much about in my book and in so many shows that I do, that were created initially by, or at least sorted into the 7 liberal sciences as we know it today, by Enoch, son of Cain. And this is the knowledge that merges with the illicit knowledge of heaven and partners with the Nephilim to usurp the world. So they're going to set up mystery schools for the sciences. They're going to set up the Enochian mysticism that the Essenes also hold Enoch, son of Cain, in a very high esteem. And it's going to partner with the Nephilim and the fallen angels and the descendants of Cain to bring the antediluvian world to its knees and into apocalypse, and it's going to cross the flood and affect us through history. And we're going to connect these elementals back to these vain philosophies because this is part of what is trying to put the world under bondage and deception. And so as we move forward in Colossians 2:18, we need to understand that these are, that we're being warned here now in Colossians 2:18 not to be deceived or beguiled, just as Eve was beguiled, deceived, to worship angels and to worship the fallen angels, and to whom the Essenes would not give up the names even upon death of the names of the angels that they would worship. So we have the angels now linked into it, just as we have these sciences and these philosophies of the world. And philosophy is the theology of the sciences and the Gnostics. And philosophy is what guides all of the sciences. It's its arbitrator. It's the one that gives its intellectual dynamite to develop the things and then impose that on the world, that we need to be very, very careful of, as we talked about with pharmaceuticals and sorcerers. And these 7 sciences were created in the antediluvian epoch by Enoch in this organizational structure of Nephilim, fallen angels, and Cainites that paraded the world into the first apocalypse by water for humans. And these sciences were designed to do these basic things. And the first one is to lead people away from God. The second one is to not give God credit for anything. The third one is to degrade, diminish, and dismiss God and not give him credit for anything. And then the fourth one is to build monuments to honor their pantheon of gods. So everything they do in those sciences, and just as shown by their iconology and their doctrines, are to honor these pantheon of gods. In the modern era, starting in 1660 with the creation of the Royal Society, you have Freemasons and Rosicrucians who are going to create the society, which is the modern scientific and educational world outside of the Roman Church that all education and science still pays homage back to today. And they call themselves the last of the sorcerers and the first of the scientists. And they are the wizards that are using this philosophical, intellectual dynamite to guide and to arbitrate the sciences to honor those pantheon of gods. And they've done the same thing as they did in the ages past. They lead people away from God. They don't give God credit for anything like creating the universe. They don't give God credit for anything. They degrade God, and they try and dismiss God to a level that he is just a lower angel in recognition, which is the duality of those polytheist religions. And then with the sciences, they do everything to honor the pantheon of gods. And again, we see that in spades with how science and education is working today, where anything that has to do with Christianity is abolished. So that it's not free for study, for talk, or anything. And so we see that these are part of the rudiments and the elements of the world that keep us into bondage. And in verse 15, we learn about the powers that Jesus triumphed over. And the powers are exousia and or dunamis, as it's used in some other passages, and the principalities, the arca, that Jesus triumphed over. And so we have that preceding verse 18 where it's talking about not worshiping angels, and the context for this philosophy of men and the rudiments of the world. And we're also told that these rudiments of the world make us dead in Christ. So even after we've been saved, we have that temptation, because this philosophy, this theology, this belief system is everywhere, and it's being guided by these elements that are part of the hierarchical order of the fallen angels. And so when we talk about the size and scope of this operation, it has tentacles absolutely everywhere, both visible and invisible, both with fallen angels and with their followers on the earth. And it's one of those reasons why it's so hard not to be brainwashed in terms of what's going on today. So as we now bring this back to the elementals as to who they are, and we're going to talk about, how they're defined, and you're going to understand just how they have carried so much of this off. So elementals, as it comes out of the dictionary, are described, and you're going to be very interested in some of these definitions. They're described as a nature of a constituent, or the basic nature, or that elemental principle part in the beginning that we talked about. So same as out of the Bible, but pertaining to rudiments, or the first principle. So when you have the translators using rudiments and elements, you can kind of understand, because dictionary comes out of the sciences, right? And it is influenced by the sciences and the people controlling the sciences. And the word meaning is pertaining to agencies, forces, and gods. This is out of the dictionary. And it means of great power, of elemental grandeur is another word. And also that these elementals are related to the forces of water, fire, earth, and air. Now, isn't that kind of interesting? Because we talked about these elementals as being little fairy people. And the elementals in their three different categories are all part of, in the fairy mythos, part of those four elements of the earth. And that's also part of their mythos as they talk about the elements of the earth in Gnosticism and mysticism. And when we talk about them related to water, like the nymphs, they all have a role in this whole sort of organizational architecture of the religion and their position in the hierarchy. So when we look at these aliens, And I'm sorry, if we look at these elementals, and we look at some of the alien descriptions, you have like the gray aliens, which are the most common ones. And these ones, they tend to be small, these big heads, these large eyes, and they have, obviously spaceships and technology, and they experiment on people. And what's interesting about that is that this is the same description as we get in a classification of the elementals that are known as the Greys, and in Scotland as the Grey Neighbours, and they come through portals with their flying machines, fairy mounds, whatever portal location a portal might be located at. They kidnap people for a fortnight or 14 days, and they do experimentation on them, and they're looking to somehow regenerate their DNA, and this is why they need humans. So obviously they can't populate the same way they can, or these are some sort of created bodies, or however they've come about. I'm going to come back to that in a second. And these are beings that are, very much like the Greys out of the alien phenomena. And in fact, the descriptions of them, if you didn't know, were being described about a fairy encounter or a fairy kidnapping with their spaceships and things, is that you would think it was a gray alien abduction. And these fairies have great knowledge, just as the gnomes are the classification for these greys. And the gnomes, which is the root word as it comes out of, or an etymology that comes out of Gnosticism, they looked after the knowledge and helped with the sciences. And they looked after the genealogies and the technology. And the fairies are known to have significant technology in that they can use in the physical world. And so when we look at these creatures that are creatures of the air, earth, fire, and water, they are something different than the angels. They're more akin to something like the Nephilim, and I think they're more like a Nephilim type of creation. And so just as the Tuatha De Danann take their history back to the goddess of a goddess in Rome, which was Diana, and also has equivalents around the other pantheons. She was the god of the fairies and god of magic and goddess of the witches, and is also the goddess of the tribe of Tuatha De Danann, where it's thought that the name Danann comes from Daoan or Diane, as you have the different transliterations. And it's also the tribe of Anu with the D, the tribe of Danu. So again, there's a Sumerian relationship as well. And as we mentioned, these are the people, the Nephilim, that migrated both before and after the flood out of the Middle East area and into Ireland and into the northern regions of Europe as well. And so these are beings that I think are a Nephilim kind of creature. And it's going to become a little bit more apparent as we provide a little bit more detail on these individuals. And they are, I think, as we get out of polytheism, where, for example, you have, the nymphs, which are considered the middle race of beings in the Kabbalah and the lowest of the spiritual order. These are created in Greek mythology, from a couple of gods. In Greek mythology, you would have Doris and Nereus, which would be procreating to create these nymphs. And all of these fairy people, the elementals, the various different kinds, are an offspring of the gods somehow. So whether or not it's an actual physical copulation as with the Nephilim, or some sort of DNA manipulation, they're created with the same kind of purpose. Maybe not with the same kind of power or degree of being a demigod that the Nephilim were, but were definitely a Nephilim kind of character. So whether or not they were wiped out before the flood, just as the Nephilim were, or somehow survived the flood, and or what I would probably lean towards and do with, as I do with the Nephilim or the giants and the Rephaim as they're called after the flood, I would suggest that just as giants were recreated in a second incursion as opposed to survival, although I keep the door open on that, I would think that these elementals would have been recreated after the flood as well, in the same type of violations to creation as what the Rephaim were created. Either that, or they were saved by the fallen angels and or off-world or in the earth, and with these advanced technologies and the flying machines is may have been one way where they were able to spare themselves. But they crop up throughout our post-Diluvian history, all in all continents, all around the world. So there's something to these fairy people, and it doesn't matter where you go. First Nations in North America has a rich history of these type of beings, and as associated with the Nephilim. But again, as we look at this, they are distinct. They are distinctive creation from humans, just as they're distinct from the Nephilim, as they're described by the fairy mythos and the occult. So this is the types of beings that are in charge of the sciences that I think that will report up the hierarchical ladder of the angels, that the sorcerers and the scientists, when they say they're communicating with the spirit world, I think they're communicating a lot with these types of beings. And these are the part of the beings that are going to be part of the alien unveiling, that are part of this alleged galactic nature of the universe that is fighting against the evil God of the Bible. So we need to understand how they're going to be introduced to us, as opposed to how they're actually created as a Nephilim type of creation. And as we understand it, and I think we need to sort of maybe take this under advisement that, again, through the Gnostics and the Kabbalists, they are at the lowest level as a Nephilim type of being, so lower than the Nephilim in the physical world, that are working for and descended from the fallen angels who rebelled. So they have more interactivity in this world in a physical sense than the demons do at this point in time, and or the fallen angels. I expect that's going to change as we get into the last 7 years and Revelation 9 and Revelation 12 come into play. So just wanted to give you an idea where these beings fit into the realm, and not to be deceived with how they're going to be reshaped and refocused to us as the years unfold. So bringing this back, these are the ones that, because they're involved with the knowledge, they're involved with the sciences, they're involved with the vain philosophies of this world, the theology of this world, that's going to be harmonized with the Babylonian religion in the end time. This is going to be the age of the fairies, as they like to talk about in the fairy mythos, that's coming back because it's knowledge and history is just so powerful. And in their mythos, they would even connect that back to the pharaohs, although to me that's more of an etymological linkage that I'm not sure is quite there. But in their belief system, they would link that back. And I guess if they're connected to the Rephaim, that's probably how they're connecting that back. But they are going to be presented in the end time. It's going to help Babylon come about. And of course, in all alien science fiction, they all have the religion of Babylon, so it's all going to fit. And just as Gnosticism created Theosophy, which is the root of the New Age, which comes about with the alien phenomena in the late 40s, this is the religion that the secret societies and the pure blood members that go back to the Rephaim and Nephilim on their genealogies, this is the religion that was created, that, as Francis Bacon talked about in the New Atlantis, the Nephilim kingdom, the 10 kings that are coming in Revelation, and in Revelation 13, 17, and in Daniel, where you have the 10 kings, the 10 toes, and the 10 horns, is the allegory of what's being talked about. For this New Atlantis, you have this religion of Theosophy, that is rooted in the elementals and the fallen angels, that is going to be the religion of the end time that harmonizes science together. And that's why they're the wizards behind the curtain, and it's the intellectual dynamite that's going to match up with the theological dynamite to bring about Babylon through catastrophes and revelations to cattle herd people into the end time. And then I just wanted to leave people to close out on this, that we actually do get one reference to little people in the Bible that most people aren't aware of, and that comes in Ezekiel 37:11, where the Gammadim, that's Gammadim, I am would be the male plural, man the walls and the towers in the time of Nebuchadnezzar and around the area of Tyre, as I understand that passage. And Gammad is the singular, which is defined as brave warriors. But here's the thing. It's rooted in 1574, and Gammadin is 1575. And 1574 is Gamad, which means either a cubit or a span. But typically it's understood as a cubit, which would be 18 to 21 inches. So these beings that were manning the walls and the towers in the time of Nebuchadnezzar and the dispersion of Judah were manned by the little people. And I don't know whether or not they're descendants or just, the pygmies that we would understand them as today. We're not told any more information on them, but it's interesting. We actually have a reference of the little people in Ezekiel. I just thought I would share that. So if you're looking for a little bit more information on that, get a hold of me at my website in terms of when I'm talking about the elementals, and I have a document on it I can send you. And that's at the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6, the number 6conspiracy.com. And thank you for listening to me, and looking forward to talking with you in a couple of weeks again when we have one more edition of the Christian Contrarian. Thank you and goodbye.